I'm Agustin Rayo. I'm a philosophy professor at MIT, and today I want to tell you about the grandfather paradox, which is a famous paradox of time travel. Imagine Bruno. Bruno has a grudge against his grandfather, and rightly so. His grandfather was a horrible man. Amongst many other things, he perpetrated this fraud that left millions of people in poverty. So there's nothing Bruno would want more than to kill grandfather. Unfortunately, grandfather's already dead. Grandfather died many years before Bruno was born. But that needn't stop Bruno, because Bruno has constructed a time machine and intends to travel to the past to kill grandfather when he was still a young man. In fact, he wants to travel back enough in time that he can kill grandfather before grandfather had any children. So, picture Bruno. He's traveled back in time. He's brought a sniper's rifle with him, and he's trained himself to use it. He's been tracking grandfather's movements and knows exactly where he goes for his morning walk. He's found a perfect spot in a nearby building, and he has a clear shot. Grandfather is walking. He stops to tie his shoelaces. Bruno caresses the trigger. And what happens? We know that Bruno will not succeed in killing grandfather. Why? Well, I already told you that grandfather is Bruno's grandfather. And from that, it follows that grandfather must have lived long enough to have children. But on this story, Bruno has traveled to a time before the time when grandfather had children. So if Bruno were to succeed, grandfather would never have any children, which would contradict what I already told you about. Maybe you think that the story could be interpreted differently. Maybe you think that we can imagine a situation in which Bruno kills grandfather. As a result, the fraud never takes place, so Bruno travels back to the present and finds that everyone is much happier. I claim that that doesn't make any sense. But I think it's easy to think otherwise, because there are lots of movies that tell stories which are kind of like that one. One good example of this is one of my favorite films, Back to the Future. Now, I don't know if you've seen Back to the Future, but it's very easy to give you a quick summary. So according to the film, there's this guy, Marty McFly, who has a father, George, and nobody respects George. But Marty gains access to a time machine, which is a specially modified DeLorean. He gets into the DeLorean, reaches a certain speed, there's a flash of bright light, and that allows him to travel to the past, to a time when his father was a young man. He interacts with his father. He changes his father's character. And when Marty comes back to the future, he finds his father a changed man. He finds that now everybody respects his father, and his father is very, very happy. My colleague Brad Scow once taught me a wonderful way of seeing just why this story is inconsistent. Because look, at the beginning of the film, we're told that at a certain time, 1985, George is respected by nobody. And at the end of the film, we're told that at that very time, in 1985, everyone respects George. But look, it doesn't matter whether we're told one thing at the beginning of the film and a different thing at the end of the film. It's still inconsistent. One way to see this is to imagine that you're sitting on a jury. The witness takes the stand, and at the beginning of her testimony, she says that at the crucial time, she was buying cigarettes at the store. And towards the end of her testimony, she says that at that very same time, she was instead at home watching TV. You can tell right there that not everything in the witness's story is true. And that's because her story is inconsistent. And it doesn't help that part of the story was told at the beginning of her testimony and the other part was told at the end of her testimony. The story is still inconsistent. I think the same thing happens with Back to the Future. Just because we're told one thing at the beginning of the story and a different thing at the end of the story, that doesn't mean that the story is consistent. There's a different way of interpreting Back to the Future where it is a consistent story. It's just that on this different interpretation, it's not primarily a time travel story. It's really a story about travel between universes. On this interpretation, what happens is that when Marty McFly boards the DeLorean, what happens is not that he goes to the past of his own universe. What happens is that he travels to a different universe. In this different universe, he meets copies of his parents, interacts with them, and then he goes to the future of that universe and finds the older copies of his parents to be very happy and respected by all. Notice, however, that that's not the interpretation that is suggested by the movie, because on that interpretation, the movie is a tragedy. Think of Marty's poor original father stuck in our universe. It's not only the case that nobody respects him, he was also abandoned by his son, Marty. In summary, I think that insofar as we interpret Back to the Future as an ordinary, bona fide time travel story, we have to concede that even though it's a great movie, it's logically inconsistent. Similarly, when we interpret the story of Bruno and his grandfather as an ordinary, bona fide time travel story, we cannot say consistently that grandfather is his grandfather and that Bruno succeeds in killing him at a time before he had children. This leaves us with a very tricky question. We know that Bruno will not succeed in killing grandfather. But what stops him? Here are some different options for answering this question. One thing you could say is what stops him is that time travel is impossible, so he could have never been in that position. Another thing you could say is that the universe contains a special anti-paradox force, and that if Bruno was about to succeed in killing grandfather, somehow this force would come down and intervene. I think there is no need to go in for either of these options. If you ask me what stops Bruno from killing grandfather, I say, I don't know, because you haven't finished telling the story. But probably what stops him is something quite mundane. On some ways of developing the story, it'll turn out that Bruno was pointing the rifle but lost his nerve at the very last minute. On other ways of spelling out the story, he got distracted. Maybe there's a barking dog in the background. On other ways of telling the story, he shoots but misses. We know that there are some inconsistent time travel stories, but that doesn't mean that every time travel story is inconsistent. There are perfectly consistent ways of telling the story of Bruno and his grandfather. And on some of these, there are perfectly mundane reasons for explaining why Bruno failed. It could be that time travel is technologically impossible. So it could be that it will remain forever beyond our reach. But that doesn't mean that time travel itself is logically inconsistent. In fact, I think the concept of time travel is perfectly consistent.